The rain drizzled lightly over the vast green fields of Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, a place where silence carried the weight of countless unspoken stories. David Whitman, a man in his late 50s, stepped out of his sleek black sedan, his polished shoes crunching against the damp gravel as he made his way toward a familiar gravestone. He came here every year on this exact date, October 12th, to honor the memory of the only woman he had ever truly loved. His hands, steady yet aged with time, carried a bouquet of white lilies, Elena's favorite. Every visit to this grave was a reminder of what he had lost, of the decisions that had shaped his life into the lonely existence it had become. David was a man of power and wealth, a real estate tycoon who had built an empire from the ground up. His name was known across New York City, appearing in headlines, business magazines, and on towering billboards advertising his latest luxury apartment projects. He had everything a man could desire: money, influence, and a lifestyle envied by many. Yet, in these quiet moments at the cemetery, none of it mattered. Here, he was not the ruthless businessman, not the calculating investor, but simply a grieving man who had once held a love so pure that even time had failed to erase it. Elena had been the only softness in his hardened world. They had met decades ago when he was still a young man struggling to make something of himself in Manhattan. She had worked at a small art gallery in Soho, her eyes always filled with dreams and her heart always ready to love. Unlike David, who had been obsessed with ambition, Elena believed in moments, small, beautiful moments that made life meaningful. She would drag him to parks, force him to take long walks on the Brooklyn Bridge, and remind him that life was more than just numbers and deals. She had been his light, his balance, until the day she vanished from his life without a trace. David had searched for her. He had used every connection, every resource, but Elena had disappeared like a whisper in the wind. For years he had wondered why she left, whether he had done something to push her away. The questions had haunted him, lingering like ghosts in the corners of his mind. And then 5 years ago he had found her, here in this cemetery. Not in life but in death. He had arrived too late, only to learn that she had died of an illness, leaving behind no explanation, no closure. Only a name etched on a gravestone. He kneeled before her grave, the rain soaking through his coat as he placed the lilies gently on the ground. "It's been 5 years, Elena," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "And I still don't have the answers." His fingers traced the cold stone, the engraving of her name feeling like a wound that would never heal. He closed his eyes, letting the memories flood back. Her laughter, her scent, the way she had made his world feel less empty. A sudden movement in the distance caught his attention. He wasn't alone. A young man, probably in his early 20s, stood a few feet away, his hands shoved into the pockets of his worn-out leather jacket. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the edges and a lean frame that suggested hardship rather than privilege. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of sadness and hesitation, as he stared at the same grave David was kneeling before. David frowned. He had never seen anyone else visit Elena's grave. He had assumed she had no family left, no one who still remembered her. But this young man, he wasn't just passing by. There was something in the way he looked at the grave, something deeply personal. David slowly rose to his feet, his sharp eyes studying the stranger. "Did you know her?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. The young man hesitated, shifting slightly as if deciding whether to answer. Then after a long pause he spoke, his voice rough yet filled with a strange familiarity. "She was my mother." David's heart stopped. For a moment the world around him blurred, the rain, the trees, the gravestones, all fading into a haze. He stared at the boy, searching for signs, for proof that this wasn't some cruel trick of the universe. "What did you say?" His voice was barely above a whisper. The young man exhaled sharply, running a hand through his damp hair. "Elena Whitman was my mother," he repeated, his gaze locking onto David's. "And if what she told me is true, then you're my father." David felt the ground shift beneath him as if the earth itself had cracked open. The words crashed over him like a tidal wave, sweeping away every assumption he had ever held. He had a son. A son he never knew existed. A son Elena had kept from him all these years. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing through 1,000 questions, but only one managed to escape his lips. Why didn't she tell me?" The young man, his son, gave a bitter smile, one that held years of unanswered pain. "I guess that's something you'll have to figure out," he said. Then without another word he turned and walked away, disappearing into the misty rain, leaving David standing alone in front of Elena's grave, more lost than he had ever been in his entire life. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. David stood frozen in place, the sound of the rain fading into a distant murmur. The words the young man had spoken still echoed in his mind, each syllable cutting through him like a blade. She was my mother. You're my father. He tried to grasp the reality of it, but it felt unreal, like a dream slipping through his fingers. His son, his own flesh and blood, had been standing right in front of him, and he had walked away. His legs felt weak as he reached out, resting a trembling hand on Elena's gravestone for support. Why had she kept this from him? Why had she let him live all these years believing she had disappeared without a reason? His breath came in shallow gasps as he turned, scanning the cemetery for any sign of the young man. But he was gone, lost in the shadows of the trees and the gray mist settling over Brooklyn. For the first time in years, David felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: panic. He had spent his life controlling everything around him, ensuring that nothing ever caught him off guard. Yet here he was, standing in the rain, powerless. He had to find him. He couldn't just let him disappear. He needed answers. With hurried steps, he rushed toward the cemetery's entrance, his eyes darting from side to side, searching for any sign of the boy. As he reached the main road, his heart pounded when he spotted a lone figure walking away, shoulders hunched against the cold. Without thinking, David called out, his voice breaking through the evening silence. "Wait." The young man stopped but didn't turn around. David took a deep breath, his pulse racing as he closed the distance between them. When he reached him, he hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Please, don't walk away. I need to understand." The young man turned slowly, his dark eyes unreadable. Up close, David could see the faint resemblance, something in the shape of his jaw, the sharpness of his gaze. It unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected. The boy, however, looked unimpressed. "Understand what?" His voice carried a quiet resentment. "That you never knew I existed? That my mother raised me alone while you built your empire?" David flinched. He had always prided himself on being a man who faced the truth head-on, but this was a truth he wasn't prepared for. "I swear to you I had no idea," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "She never told me." He searched the boy's face for some sign that he believed him, but there was only guarded skepticism. "What's your name?" David asked, realizing he didn't even know the most basic thing about his own son. Pause. Then reluctantly the boy answered, "Nathan." Nathan. The name felt foreign yet strangely familiar, as if it had been waiting in some hidden part of his soul all these years. David swallowed the lump in his throat. "Nathan. I don't know why Elena didn't tell me. I don't know why she kept you from me. But I need to know. Please, tell me about her." Nathan let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "You want me to tell you about her?" he asked bitterly. "Where were you when she was sick? When she was struggling to pay rent? When she worked double shifts just to keep us afloat? Do you have any idea how many nights she cried herself to sleep, wondering if she made the right decision?" David felt as if he had been punched in the gut. He had spent years mourning Elena, believing she had chosen to leave him, never imagining that she had been suffering. The thought of her struggling while he lived in penthouses and signed multimillion-dollar deals made him sick to his stomach. "I didn't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I had, I would have." Nathan cut him off. "You would have what? Shown up like some hero and fixed everything with your money?" His eyes burned with anger. "That's the difference between us. You think money solves everything. But she didn't need your money. She needed you. And you weren't there." David felt the weight of those words settle deep in his chest. He had no defense, no justification. Only the harsh reality that he had failed Elena without even knowing it. "You're right," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "I wasn't there. And I can't change that. But I want to know you, Nathan. If there's even a chance to make things right, I'll take it." Nathan stared at him for a long moment as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Then with a sigh he looked away. "It's too late," he murmured. "She's gone. And you're just a stranger." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the city's endless streets. David stood motionless, watching his son vanish into the night, feeling more lost than he had ever felt before. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. David sat in his penthouse apartment on Fifth Avenue, staring at the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. New York had always been his kingdom, a place where he thrived, where every deal, every skyscraper, every financial triumph had been another trophy in his collection. But tonight the city felt cold, unfamiliar. His reflection in the glass looked like that of a stranger, a man who had everything yet nothing at all. Nathan's words echoed in his mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. She didn't need your money. She needed you. He had spent years believing Elena had abandoned him, when in reality she had been raising his son alone, suffering in ways he couldn't even imagine. The thought of her working double shifts, struggling to pay rent while he built his empire, made his stomach turn. How had he not known? How had he never felt it in his soul that a part of him had been out there, growing up without him? His mind raced back to the cemetery, to the moment he saw Nathan for the first time. He hadn't needed a DNA test to confirm it. He had seen it in the boy's eyes, in the sharp angles of his face. He was David's son, there was no doubt. And yet, Nathan had walked away, leaving David with more questions than answers. He couldn't let it end like this. He had spent his life controlling outcomes, ensuring things went his way. He had to find Nathan again. He had to understand. Reaching for his phone, he dialed the number of the one person he knew could help, Robert Vega, a private investigator he had used in the past. Within minutes, Robert answered, his voice calm and professional. "Mr. Whitman, what can I do for you?" David hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "I need you to find someone. A young man named Nathan. I don't have a last name. I just know his mother was Elena Whitman." There was a pause on the other end before Robert spoke again. "I'll see what I can do." The next day, David buried himself in work, trying to distract himself from the storm inside his head. Meetings, contracts, financial reports. None of it held the same meaning it once did. For the first time in years, the weight of his success felt hollow. He had spent his life building wealth, but for what? What was the point if the one thing that truly mattered had slipped through his fingers? By the evening his phone buzzed. It was Robert. "I found him," the investigator said simply. "Nathan Whitman. 23 years old. Lives in Queens in a small apartment near Astoria Park. Works at a garage on Steinway Street." David exhaled, gripping the edge of his desk. "Send me the address." Later that night, he found himself parked outside a rundown apartment building in Queens. It was a far cry from the luxury of Manhattan, the kind of place he had never imagined his child growing up in. The stairs were rusted, the paint peeling from the walls. He hesitated before stepping out of his car, his heartbeat loud in his ears. He had closed billion-dollar deals, faced ruthless competitors, but standing in front of this door about to confront his own son, made him more nervous than he had ever been. He knocked twice. The door opened slightly, revealing Nathan's wary face. The moment he saw David, his expression hardened. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded. David took a deep breath. "I just want to talk." Nathan scoffed, shaking his head. "You don't give up, do you?" "No," David admitted. "Not when something matters." For a long moment, Nathan didn't move. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he stepped aside, allowing David inside. The apartment was small, cluttered, with worn-out furniture and walls covered in sketches and blueprints. David's eyes flickered to them, recognizing the detailed mechanical designs. "You're an engineer?" he asked. Nathan shrugged. "Trying to be. Studying part-time at City College of New York. Working at the garage to pay for it." David felt another pang of guilt. His son had been working to put himself through school while David had more money than he could ever spend. He cleared his throat. "I didn't come here to judge your life. He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I just need to understand. Why didn't she tell me?" Nathan crossed his arms, leaning against the counter. "Because she didn't want to be your charity case. She knew you had your empire, your priorities. She didn't want to drag you into something you didn't choose." David's chest tightened. "But I would have chosen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I would have been there." Nathan let out a dry laugh. "Would you? Or would you have written a check and moved on?" David clenched his jaw. He had never felt so powerless in his life. "I can't change the past, Nathan. But I can be here now. If you'll let me." Nathan studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then with a sigh he turned away. "I don't know if I can trust you," he admitted. "But I guess we'll see." David felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't acceptance. But it was a start. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. David sat across from Nathan in the small apartment, feeling like an outsider in his own son's world. The silence between them was thick, filled with the weight of years they had lost. David wanted to say something, anything to break the barrier between them, but he had never been good at expressing emotions. Business negotiations, boardroom debates, those were his strengths. But this was foreign territory. Nathan, on the other hand, looked guarded, his arms crossed as he leaned against the counter, his sharp eyes studying David as if trying to determine whether he was worth trusting. David noticed the sketches pinned to the walls, intricate mechanical designs, blueprints, and engineering drafts. They weren't just random drawings, they were detailed, precise, filled with calculations. He pointed to one of them. "Did you design this?" he asked, genuinely curious. Nathan hesitated before nodding. "Yeah. It's for a project I've been working on at school." David stepped closer, examining the sketch. "This is impressive. You have real talent." Nathan scoffed. "Thanks, but talent doesn't pay tuition." David felt another pang of guilt. His son had been struggling to put himself through college while he had been living in luxury, unaware of his existence. He wanted to help, to fix things, but he knew throwing money at the problem wouldn't change the past. "What's your goal?" David asked, keeping his voice careful. "What do you want to do after graduation?" Nathan studied him for a moment before answering. "I want to work in automotive engineering. Designing more efficient engines, maybe even start my own company someday." David nodded, feeling a strange sense of pride. "That's a solid plan. Have you thought about internships?" "Connections." Nathan let out a dry laugh. "Connections? I barely have enough time to study between work shifts. I don't exactly have people lining up to give me opportunities." David hesitated. He wanted to offer help, but he didn't want to overstep. "If you ever need guidance, I know people in the industry. I could make a few calls." Nathan's expression darkened. "I don't need handouts." "It's not a handout," David said firmly. "It's support. The kind a father should give his son." Nathan flinched at the word father, and David immediately regretted saying it so soon. He knew trust wasn't something that could be built overnight. "Look, I'm not here to push myself into your life," David continued. "But I lost so much time already. I don't want to waste whatever chance I have left." Nathan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's not that simple." "I know," David admitted. "But maybe we could start small. A meal. A conversation. No expectations, just getting to know each other." Nathan hesitated for a long time before finally nodding. "Fine. One meal. That's it." Relief flooded through David. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next evening they met at a small diner near Nathan's apartment. It wasn't the kind of place David was used to, far from the high-end restaurants where waiters knew his name and champagne flowed freely. But as they sat across from each other, David realized that this place suited Nathan. It was real, unpretentious, just like him. They ordered their food, and for a while there was only silence between them. Then, slowly, Nathan started talking, not about anything deeply personal but about his work, his studies, the things he was passionate about. David listened, absorbing every word. It was the first real conversation they had, and for the first time, David felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could earn a place in Nathan's life. As they finished their meal, David reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "I meant what I said about helping you," he said, sliding it across the table. "No pressure. Just if you ever need advice or an opportunity, this is my direct line." Nathan hesitated before taking the card, slipping it into his wallet without a word. It wasn't a promise, but it was something. As they stepped outside, the cool night air wrapped around them. Nathan shoved his hands into his pockets. "This doesn't change anything," he muttered. "But, thanks for dinner." David nodded. "One step at a time." Nathan glanced at him for a long moment before giving a small nod. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. David watched him go, a mixture of emotions swirling inside him. He had no idea where this road would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had something worth fighting for. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. David had always been a man of action. Throughout his life, he had made decisions with the kind of certainty that came from years of experience. He was accustomed to being in control, to knowing what was coming next. But in this new chapter of his life with Nathan, he felt like he was navigating uncharted waters. It had been weeks since their dinner at the diner, and while they hadn't spoken much since, David couldn't shake the feeling that things were slowly starting to change. Nathan hadn't called, but he hadn't shut David out either. The silence between them was less uncomfortable now, like a quiet truce that both of them were honoring. It was a fragile peace, but it was peace nonetheless. David had done everything he could to keep their connection alive without overwhelming Nathan. He sent a few text messages, checking in every once in a while, never pushing too hard. And every now and then Nathan would respond. The messages were brief but civil. No talk of the past, just updates on school and work, nothing that hinted at any deeper connection. Still, David clung to those small signs. He knew it was going to take time. He had to prove to Nathan that he wasn't just another wealthy man trying to buy his way into his life. Nathan had made it clear in their first conversation that he wasn't interested in charity, and David respected that. He wasn't looking to buy Nathan's affection. He just wanted a chance to earn it. It was a Saturday afternoon when Nathan finally reached out. David's phone buzzed, and when he saw the name on the screen, his heart skipped a beat. It was Nathan with a simple message, "You free to grab coffee?" David didn't hesitate. He replied within seconds, "Absolutely." When and where? They agreed to meet at a cafe in Brooklyn, a place Nathan said was one of his favorites. It was a small, independent spot on Court Street, nestled between old brick buildings, the kind of place where the barista knew every customer's name. David arrived early, his nerves buzzing with anticipation. This was a chance, maybe the first real one, to build something with his son. When Nathan walked in, David immediately noticed how much he looked like Elena. It wasn't just the way he carried himself. It was in the tilt of his head, the way his eyes sparkled when he was focused. For a moment, it took everything in David not to let the flood of emotions overwhelm him. But he quickly pushed those feelings aside. Nathan was here, and that was all that mattered. They exchanged greetings, and Nathan led David to a corner table by the window. It was a quiet spot, with a view of the busy street outside, the hustle and bustle of Brooklyn's midday life moving in the background. Nathan ordered a coffee black just like his mother used to take it, and David followed suit. They sat down, and for the first time in weeks, David felt the weight of the silence between them ease a little. "So," Nathan began, breaking the quiet, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said that night." David nodded, unsure of where this conversation was going. "What part?" "You know, about wanting to get to know me, wanting to be involved," Nathan said, taking a sip of his coffee. "I've been kind of a jerk about it, haven't I?" David almost didn't believe his ears. Nathan was apologizing. He hadn't expected that. "No, you haven't been a jerk," David said, his voice calm. "You've been honest, and I respect that." Nathan looked down at his cup, his fingers tapping nervously on the ceramic. I don't know what to make of all this. I've spent my whole life thinking I was alone in this, and now you're telling me that you've been out there the whole time, living a completely different life." David felt the weight of those words sink in. He had never understood the impact his absence had on Nathan, but hearing it now, seeing the hurt in his eyes, made him feel the enormity of what he had missed. "I can't change what happened, Nathan. But I can be here now. If you'll let me." Nathan didn't respond right away. He seemed lost in thought, his gaze drifting to the street outside. "I don't know if I can just forget everything," he said quietly. "I've built my life without you. I've learned to rely on myself, and it's not easy just to let someone in." David understood. He had built his life around achievements and acquisitions, but none of that mattered now. None of it could replace the relationship he had never had with his son. "I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking for a chance to be part of your life. No strings attached, no expectations. Just us figuring this out together." Nathan met his gaze then, his expression softening for the first time. "I'm still pissed about a lot of things. About how everything went down. But I'm also curious. And I guess that's something, right?" David smiled, feeling a sense of relief he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "That's more than enough for me." For the next hour they talked. Slowly the walls began to come down. They discussed everything: school, Nathan's dreams for the future, even the awkwardness of their first meeting. David told Nathan about his work, his life, but he made sure to listen more than he spoke. He knew this wasn't just about him. This was about Nathan and about the time they had lost. As they stood to leave, Nathan surprised him. "You know," he said, "maybe we could do this again. Grab coffee." "I don't know about being a family or anything, but," he trailed off, then added, "maybe we could try. One step at a time, right?" David's heart lifted, and for the first time he allowed himself to hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a beginning. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. David found himself checking his phone more often than usual, waiting for a message that might not come. Ever since their meeting at the cafe, he had felt a shift in the air, a change in the way Nathan saw him. It wasn't an open door, not yet, but at least it wasn't locked anymore. A few days had passed, and though Nathan hadn't reached out again, David didn't want to push him. He knew this was going to take patience, something he had plenty of in business but had never needed so much in his personal life. Then late one evening, as he sat in his penthouse overlooking the New York skyline, his phone buzzed. He grabbed it quickly, his heart leaping a little when he saw Nathan's name. The message was simple: "Hey, you busy?" David responded immediately. "Not at all." What's up? Nathan took a few minutes before replying. Just thinking. You free to talk? David felt a surge of relief. Maybe, just maybe, this was progress. Of course. Call anytime. A moment later his phone rang. David answered on the first ring. Hey Nathan. There was a brief silence on the other end, and then Nathan exhaled as if he had been debating whether or not to go through with the call. Hey, he said finally. So, I guess I just wanted to ask you something. Go ahead, David said, keeping his tone neutral. I was wondering about my mom, Nathan said hesitantly. You told me a little about how you met her, but I never really got to hear your side of the story. David felt his chest tighten. He had spent years trying to forget the past, but now, with Nathan on the line, he realized he wanted to remember. Your mother was incredible, he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. We met in college back in Boston. She was studying journalism and I was drowning in finance classes. I was so caught up in my career goals that I barely noticed the world around me. But your mom, she made sure people noticed her, not because she was loud but because she had this energy about her. She could walk into a room and somehow make everyone feel like they belonged there. Nathan was silent for a moment before he said, That sounds like her. David smiled, though there was sadness in it. She had this way of making life feel bigger than it was. She believed in things, in people. She used to tell me that success wasn't just about making money, it was about making a difference. And back then I was too young and too focused on my ambitions to really understand what she meant. So what happened? Nathan asked, his voice softer now. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. I was offered a job in New York right after graduation. It was everything I had ever wanted. A position at one of the top firms, a fast track to success. Your mom wanted to stay in Boston for a while longer, to finish an internship she was passionate about. We promised to make it work long distance, but I was young and selfish. I put my career before everything else. Before her. Nathan didn't say anything for a while, and David worried that he had said too much. But then Nathan spoke again. She never really talked about you much, he admitted. I mean, I always knew who you were, but she didn't say much about what happened. I guess I always assumed you just left and never looked back. David swallowed the lump in his throat. I didn't want to leave her, Nathan. I thought I was doing the right thing at the time. I told myself I would come back for her, that once I had built my career we could pick up where we left off. But life doesn't work that way. Time moves forward, and by the time I realized how much I had lost, she was gone. Nathan let out a deep breath. Yeah, he said quietly. She was gone. David felt the weight of those words. I regret it, Nathan. Every single day. Another silence stretched between them, but it wasn't as tense as before. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people are finally understanding each other. Finally, Nathan spoke again. I think I want to know more, he admitted. Not just about her. About you. About everything. David's heart swelled. I would like that, he said sincerely. Nathan hesitated, then added, but it has to be on my terms. No pressure, no expectations. Of course, David agreed. Whenever you're ready. There was a small pause, and then Nathan said something that caught David completely off guard. Do you think she would have wanted us to know each other? David's throat tightened. I know she would, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Your mother always believed in second chances. Nathan didn't say anything right away, but when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost thoughtful. Maybe we could meet again soon. Just to talk. David felt a rush of hope, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. I'd like that, he said warmly. As they ended the call, David sat back, staring out at the city lights. For the first time in years he felt something shift inside him. He had spent so long running from the past, from his mistakes, but maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to make things right. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. David arrived early at the small cafe in Brooklyn where he and Nathan had agreed to meet. He chose a table near the window, his hands clasped together as he tried to steady his nerves. It had been years since he had felt this level of anticipation, this mixture of hope and anxiety. The first meeting had gone better than he had expected, but now came the real challenge, proving to Nathan that he was serious about being in his life. The doorbell chimed, and David looked up to see Nathan walking in, his posture slightly tense, but there was no hesitation in his step. That alone gave David some relief. Nathan spotted him and walked over, sliding into the seat across from him without a word. Thanks for coming, David said carefully, studying his son's face for any sign of how he was feeling. Nathan shrugged. Figured it wouldn't hurt to talk. David nodded, deciding not to push too hard. A waitress came by and they both ordered coffee. There was a moment of silence between them before Nathan spoke again. So, what exactly do you do? The question caught David slightly off guard, but he welcomed it. I run an investment firm. We manage portfolios, help businesses grow, that kind of thing. Nathan smirked slightly. So basically you make rich people richer. David chuckled, appreciating the dry humor. That's one way to put it. Nathan took a sip of his coffee. I don't really know anything about finance. Mom was more into writing and I guess I got that from her. I'm studying journalism at NYU. David's eyes widened. Journalism? That's amazing. Your mother would be so proud. Nathan shifted in his seat. Yeah, well, I don't know if I'm any good at it, but I like it. You must be good if you got into NYU, David pointed out. Nathan hesitated, then admitted, I actually got a scholarship. Mom always wanted me to follow what I loved, but college wasn't cheap. I had to work for it. David felt a pang of guilt. He had more money than he could ever spend, yet his own son had struggled to get through college. I had no idea, he said, his voice quieter now. Of course you didn't, Nathan said, though there was no anger in his tone, just a simple statement of fact. David exhaled, realizing just how much he had missed. I know I can't change the past, Nathan, but I want to be part of your future. If you'll let me. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it held the answers he was looking for. I don't know what that looks like, he admitted. Neither do I, David said honestly. But we can figure it out. No pressure, no expectations. Just one conversation at a time. Nathan looked up at him, then really looked at him, and for the first time, David felt like he was seeing something other than walls. Okay, Nathan said finally. One conversation at a time. David smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him that he hadn't felt in years. They talked for over an hour after that. About small things. Movies they liked, books Nathan was reading, David's ridiculous work schedule. It wasn't easy, and there were moments where Nathan seemed hesitant, as if he was afraid of letting his guard down too much. But David didn't mind. He knew this wasn't going to be simple. Relationships weren't built in a day. As they stepped outside the cafe, Nathan shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. I should get going. Got a paper due tomorrow. David nodded. Of course. But maybe we can do this again sometime? Nathan hesitated for only a second before nodding. Yeah. I think I'd like that. David's heart lifted. Me too. Nathan gave him a small nod before walking off into the busy Brooklyn streets, and David stood there watching him go, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, hope. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. David found himself thinking about Nathan constantly in the days that followed. Their conversation at the cafe had gone better than he had hoped, but he knew it was just the beginning of a long road. He didn't want to push too hard, but he also didn't want to let too much time pass between their meetings. He had already missed 20 years of his son's life. He wasn't about to let more slip away. So after a few days he sent Nathan a text. It was simple. Hope your paper went well. Let me know if you ever want to grab coffee again. He didn't expect an immediate response, but to his surprise, his phone buzzed a few minutes later. It went all right. Coffee sounds good. Maybe this weekend? David felt a rush of relief and quickly typed back. Sounds perfect. Let me know when and where. They met again at a different cafe in Manhattan, this time one closer to Nathan's campus. Nathan seemed a little more relaxed this time, though there was still a cautious edge to him. They talked about simple things again. David asked about Nathan's classes and Nathan, in turn, asked a few questions about David's work. It wasn't exactly a father-son bonding moment, but it was something, and David was grateful for it. As they sat in the cafe, Nathan suddenly hesitated before asking, "Why did you and my mom break up?" It was the first time he had asked something personal, something that went beyond the surface, and David knew he had to be honest. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. We were young, he admitted. I met her when I was just starting out in my career. She was amazing, smart, passionate, full of life. But I got caught up in work. I kept promising her that things would slow down, that I'd have more time for us, but it never happened. Eventually, she got tired of waiting. Nathan was quiet for a moment, then asked, Did you ever try to find her? David's throat tightened. I did. A few years after we broke up, I realized how much I had lost. But by then she had already moved to Chicago. I didn't know she was pregnant, Nathan. If I had... He trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence. Nathan looked down at his coffee, processing this. She never talked about you much, he admitted. I mean, I knew your name, but she never made you sound like a bad guy. Just, someone who wasn't there. David swallowed the lump in his throat. I regret it every day, he said softly. I should have done more. I should have fought harder to be in her life. And if I had known about you, he shook his head. I don't expect you to forgive me, Nathan. But I want you to know that if I could change the past, I would. Nathan looked at him for a long moment, then exhaled. I don't know what to do with all this, he admitted. You don't have to do anything, David said. We take it one step at a time. No pressure. Nathan nodded slowly. Okay. They sat in silence for a while after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like progress. When they finally left the cafe, David walked with Nathan a few blocks before they parted ways. Just as Nathan was about to head off, he hesitated and then said, Hey, thanks for reaching out. David smiled. Thanks for giving me a chance. As he watched Nathan disappear into the crowd, David felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he felt like he was moving forward instead of looking back. He had a long way to go, but at least now he wasn't walking that road alone. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. David couldn't remember the last time he had felt this anxious about something other than work. Over the past few weeks, he and Nathan had met a few more times, each meeting growing a little less tense, a little more natural. They weren't exactly close yet, but at least the wall Nathan had put up was beginning to crack. Today, however, was different. Today, David was inviting Nathan to his home for the first time. It wasn't a grand invitation, just dinner, something simple, but it felt monumental. He had spent the entire day preparing, making sure everything was perfect. He wasn't much of a cook, but he had arranged for a chef to prepare a meal, wanting to make a good impression without making it seem too extravagant. When the doorbell rang, he took a deep breath before opening it. Nathan stood there, looking slightly uncomfortable but not hesitant enough to back out. He was wearing a casual hoodie and jeans, a stark contrast to David's pressed shirt and slacks, but David didn't care. He was just grateful Nathan had shown up. Hey, David greeted, stepping aside to let him in. Nathan glanced around as he entered, taking in the modern yet warmly decorated penthouse overlooking Central Park. This place is nice, he said, and David could hear the underlying thought, this place is massive. David smiled. Thanks. Make yourself at home. Nathan walked further in, looking at the art on the walls, the expensive furniture, the polished floors. So this is what investment firms get you, huh? He mused, a slight smirk on his face. David chuckled. Something like that. But honestly, all of this means nothing if you don't have someone to share it with. He hadn't meant for the comment to be heavy, but Nathan seemed to pick up on it anyway. Well, you've got me here now, Nathan said, his tone teasing but his words meaningful. David's chest tightened slightly. That I do. They moved to the dining room where the table was already set, the food plated beautifully. Nathan raised an eyebrow. Did you make all this? David laughed. I wish I had some help. Nathan smirked. Figures. As they ate, the conversation flowed more easily than David had expected. They talked about Nathan's classes, his favorite books, his plans after graduation. David shared stories from his own college years, moments that made Nathan laugh, which felt like small victories. But then, as they were finishing dessert, Nathan leaned back in his chair and looked at David seriously. So what now? He asked. David set down his fork, knowing exactly what Nathan meant. That's up to you, he said honestly. I don't want to push you into anything you're not ready for. Nathan nodded, staring at his plate for a moment before looking up. I don't know how to do this, the whole father-son thing. I never really had a dad. It was just me and my mom. David swallowed the lump in his throat. We don't have to rush anything. We can just be in each other's lives in whatever way feels right. Nathan exhaled. I think I'd like that. David smiled, relief washing over him. Me too. Nathan glanced around the apartment again. I always used to wonder what my dad was like. If he was some deadbeat or if he just didn't care. He looked back at David. But you're not what I expected. David hesitated. What did you expect? Nathan smirked. Some old rich guy with no personality. David laughed. Well, I'm definitely rich, but I like to think I have at least some personality. Nathan chuckled. Yeah, you're all right. It wasn't a grand declaration of love, but it was something. And for now, that was more than enough. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. David found himself adjusting to a new rhythm in life, one that included Nathan in ways he had never imagined just months ago. Their meetings had become more frequent, evolving from occasional coffee outings to dinners, walks through Central Park, and even a few Knicks games. Each interaction chipped away at the invisible barrier that had existed between them, and while there were still moments of hesitation, David could feel their bond strengthening. It was a strange feeling, being a father so late in the game, but he cherished every moment he got to spend with Nathan. Yet, there was always a lingering fear in the back of his mind, a worry that one wrong move would send Nathan retreating again. He didn't want to push too hard or ask for too much, so he took things slowly, letting Nathan dictate the pace. One evening, as they sat in a small diner near Nathan's campus, Nathan brought up something unexpected. "I've been thinking about visiting Chicago," he said, stirring his milkshake absent-mindedly. David looked up from his plate. "Oh, any particular reason?" Nathan hesitated for a moment before sighing. "I want to visit Mom's grave." His voice was steady, but there was an underlying tension in it. "I haven't been since the funeral. I feel like it's time." David felt a pang of sadness at the mention of Olivia. He had spent so much time trying to build something with Nathan that he hadn't stopped to think about how much his son might still be grieving. "That's a good idea," David said gently. "If you want, I can come with you." Nathan glanced at him, surprised. "You'd do that?" David nodded. "Of course. If you'd rather go alone, I understand, but if you want company, I'd be honored to go with you." Nathan was quiet for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Yeah, I think I'd like that." A few days later they flew to Chicago, a city that held so much history for Nathan but very little for David. The flight was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Nathan guided David to the cemetery where Olivia was buried. The air was crisp, the sky overcast as they walked through the rows of headstones until they reached hers. Nathan stood in front of the grave, his hands in his pockets, staring at the engraved letters of his mother's name. "Hey Mom," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. David stepped back, giving Nathan a moment to himself. He watched as his son knelt down, tracing his fingers over the inscription. "I'm doing okay," Nathan said softly. "I know you worried about me a lot, but I'm figuring things out. College is good. I've made some friends. I met my dad." His voice wavered slightly. "I wasn't sure how to feel about it at first, but he's not what I expected. He's trying, Mom. And I think you'd be okay with that." David's heart clenched at those words. He had spent so long carrying the guilt of not being there for Olivia, of not knowing about Nathan, of missing so much. Hearing Nathan say that Olivia would have been okay with him being in Nathan's life felt like a small form of redemption. Nathan stood up after a while, exhaling deeply. He turned to David, his expression softer than it had been before. "Thanks for coming with me." David placed a hand on his shoulder. "Always." They left the cemetery in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable one. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, a mutual understanding passing between them. As they got into the car, Nathan turned to David with a small smile. "You hungry? There's this pizza place Mom used to take me to when I was a kid. Best deep dish in the city." David grinned. "Sounds perfect." As they drove through the streets of Chicago, something felt different. It wasn't just the city or the moment, it was them. The walls that had once been so high between them were now barely standing, and for the first time, David felt like he truly had his son in his life. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. David never imagined his life would take such a turn. From being a self-made millionaire who believed he had everything he could ever need, to realizing he had a son he never knew about, the past few months had been a whirlwind of emotions. But now, as he sat in his office overlooking the New York skyline, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: contentment. Nathan had become an integral part of his life, and despite their rough start, they had built something real. It wasn't just about making up for lost time anymore, it was about moving forward together. The trip to Chicago had changed something between them, solidifying their relationship in a way that neither had expected. David had worried that revisiting Olivia's grave might reopen old wounds, but instead, it had given them both closure. Nathan had finally allowed himself to let go of some of the pain he had been carrying, and in doing so, he had made room for David in his life. Nathan had just finished his semester, and David had invited him over for dinner at his apartment in Manhattan. It had become a new tradition. Nathan would come over, they would cook together, or at least attempt to, since neither was particularly skilled in the kitchen, and they would talk about everything from sports to business to Nathan's future plans. That evening, as Nathan chopped vegetables and David stirred a pot of pasta sauce, Nathan suddenly turned to him with a serious expression. "I've been thinking," he said. "I want to intern at your company this summer." David was taken aback. "Really?" he asked, trying to keep the excitement out of his voice. He had been hoping Nathan would take an interest in his business but didn't want to push him into anything. Nathan nodded. Yeah. I mean, I'm studying business and it just makes sense to get real-world experience. Besides, I want to see what you do up close. David set the spoon down and looked at his son. I think that's a great idea. But just so we're clear, you're going to have to work just as hard as everyone else. No special treatment. Nathan smirked. I wouldn't expect anything less. Dinner that night felt different. Lighter, as if they had finally reached a point where their relationship wasn't overshadowed by the past. They laughed, shared stories, and for the first time, David felt like he wasn't just making up for lost time, he was actually being a father. A few weeks later, Nathan started his internship at David's company. At first, some of the employees whispered about the CEO's son working among them, but Nathan quickly proved he wasn't just there to fill a role for appearances. He showed up early, stayed late, and asked smart questions. He wanted to learn not just from David but from everyone around him. David couldn't have been prouder. One evening, as they were wrapping up a long day at the office, Nathan knocked on David's door. Got a minute? He asked. David motioned for him to sit down. What's on your mind? Nathan hesitated for a moment before speaking. I know things didn't happen the way they were supposed to between us. I grew up thinking I didn't have a dad and then suddenly you were there. At first, I resented it. I resented you. But now, I'm glad I found you. He paused, taking a deep breath. Or maybe I'm glad you found me. David felt his throat tighten. He had spent so much time feeling guilty for not being there for Nathan's childhood, but hearing those words made him realize that what truly mattered was the present. I'm glad too, he said, his voice steady. I may have missed the first 18 years, but I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere. Nathan gave a small smile. Good. Because I think I might actually like having you around. David chuckled. Well, that's a relief. That summer was the best of David's life. They worked together, spent weekends catching baseball games, and even took a short trip to California just for the hell of it. Nathan had gone from being a stranger to being family, and for the first time in a long time, David felt like his life was complete. Years later, when Nathan graduated and officially joined David's company full-time, David knew he had not only gained a son but also a legacy. Nathan wasn't just his flesh and blood, he was his greatest achievement, the proof that sometimes life gives you second chances when you least expect them. And this time, David was determined not to waste a single moment. If you've liked this story, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends.